Thank you. So I'm going to quickly do an introduction because this is my first CSICon. So I am a full-time scientist. I work in life sciences biotech, but like many other scientists and health professionals, we've felt frustration about the lack of credible information on social media, on media. That's accelerated through the pandemic, and so we've all taken upon ourselves to do freelance work to try to help combat misinformation that impacts people's daily lives, impacts public health, and impacts health outcomes. So I do write a newsletter. It's freely available. It's on Substack. And I tackle a lot of topics that are in the biomedical health space, but often are mischaracterized and used to spread misinformation, often exploited by wellness influencers and the wellness industry. I've also joined various media outlets, so I was the expert for the Wired Tech Support segment on pseudoscience support. We covered everything from crystals and whether they work better when they're charged, all the way to the efficacy of dietary supplements and organic versus conventional produce. So a lot of topics that people are just misled about, often unwittingly. And I did my doctoral work in Lyme disease immunology, and Lyme is plagued with misinformation. So I also took on the role of the executive director of the American Lyme Disease Foundation, which its sole goal is to combat the very well-funded, lucrative anti-science entities that spread misinformation. But the topic I want to talk about today is why do people, especially those or even those who think or believe that they align with science, still fall prey to anti-science misinformation, still selectively reject science, even when they're staunchly in favor of scientific evidence on other topics. And this really comes down to the feelings over facts phenomenon, right? We know that even the most logical people can be led astray when their emotions take over. Their emotions prevent them from thinking critically about information. Their emotions shut down that logic, that fact-checking, even if they have training. And that's true of healthcare providers. It's true of scientists. It's true of a lot of individuals who do have a pretty critical thinking-oriented mindset. And so when we look at different types of identities that can fall prey to misinformation or to selective rejection of science, it really runs the gamut. So I'm going to call out everybody. So yeah, your progressive, educated, liberal individuals who have their yard signs that science is real, it happens to them. Your political ideologies, we have selective rejection of science on all political ideology fronts. Religious beliefs can inform and shape how someone will perceive and interpret scientific information. And yeah, who they're getting their information from. Are you a podcaster, bro? Are you listening to Joe Rogan? Are you listening to Andrew Huberman? Are they telling you that all you need to boost your immunity is AG1 supplements? And FYI, he has a $40 million contract with them. Are you someone that believes that natural is superior to synthetic because you've fallen prey to the appeal to nature fallacy? The manosphere, which Tim Caulfield spoke about quite extensively yesterday, but you just got to dive into the river, grab yourself a fish, and chomp in. And even our younger generations, our Gen Zers, 80% of them are getting their information on TikTok. They're very socially activist oriented, but they're not always getting credible information. So I was going to turn this into a quiz, and I had my Slido all set up, but then I thought that maybe doing QR codes might be a little bit too much for everyone. But here I have 5 different cohorts, identity features, and different examples of selective rejection of science based on these identities. And so you can kind of peruse these, but just to kind of walk through, your tech-savvy libertarians, your Silicon Valley bros, your biohacking bros, they routinely reject or don't believe in biomedical science advances, particularly those that are regulated by governmental agencies or regulatory authorities. But they're doing the apps. They're doing the unvalidated health tests. They're going to get their metabolic health. They're going to do their longevity hacks. And they're going to take on the most state-of-the-art electronics, even if they reject all of these other scientific interventions. Your educated and progressive liberals, these are people who are relatively affluent, moderately educated, generally white, more often women than not. And these are the individuals that fall prey to chemophobia, the appeal to nature fallacy, and they have a strong belief in environmentalism. So you often find them falling prey to misinformation about the purported harms of genetic engineering, the purported harms of pesticides and chemicals at large, even though everything is a chemical. You're a sack of chemicals. Chemicals are the reason we have cell phones and pocket computers and all of that. And so they'll be very willing to accept other biotechnology, but they're very skeptical of these tools that they've been exposed to misinformation about. Your affluent, middle-aged white women, these are your goop gals. So these are the ones that don't trust big pharma because it's for profit, but they trust the for-profit big wellness industry, which has no regulation, no requirements for safety, oversight, quality. They don't have evidence that they're even beneficial, and technically they're pharmaceuticals. Supplements are unregulated pharmaceuticals. You have your middle-class conservative men. These individuals are typically motivated by personal opinion, things that impact them, their livelihood, their economy. And so you'll find that they're often aligned with farming innovations. They will often use GE crops and have no qualms with it, but they'll reject the impacts of things like climate change because it threatens their livelihood. And then your white, middle to upper class women, these are kind of your OG anti-vaxxers, and so they're the ones where they don't want to inject the toxins into their children. They fall in prey to the lies of the 1998 Lancet study by Andrew Wakefield, but they won't blink about getting a variety of other medical interventions, even so much as getting Botox injected into their face. So the interesting thing is that these rejection of science, they vary topic by topic. Anti-vaccine rhetoric actually straddles different ideologies, but the motivation behind it varies. So progressive skepticism is informed by the fear of toxins, the fear of chemicals, the lack of understanding that the dose makes the poison, the appeal to nature fallacy, the false belief that natural substances are inherently better than synthetic substances, and of course, the exploitation of fear of their children's health. Whereas your conservative skepticism is really focused on the rejection of governmental control. I don't want people telling me what to do. The rugged individualism that has permeated American culture for so long. And when you actually look at the overall perception of whether or not science has benefited our society, we've seen a marked decline across both political parties, although the decline is more substantial when it comes to Republicans. But this is a little bit concerning because science touches everything, right? A toilet is based on science. Modern plumbing, your combustion engine in your car or your electric vehicle, your ability to bake cupcakes, that's science. All of these things are science. And so the fact that we have such a large contingency of people that think that science is a net negative on society certainly underscores the reason that we need to take this very seriously. So genetic technology has been plagued with misinformation for over 30 years, and in reality, in some cases, it's actually worsening. There are more people now that think that GMO foods are worse for your health than there were a few years back. But this doesn't fall across party lines, this falls across gender. So women are more likely than men to believe that GMOs are harmful to your health. And this plays right into the wellness industry, right into the appeal to nature fallacy. These women tend to be more liberal, more affluent, those that can afford products that have slapped on the non-GMO label, which is a scam, by the way. Those that can afford organic produce because they've been misled by the environmental working group that organic is pesticide-free, which it's not. And it's very much immersed in this perceived healthism as a function of affluence. What's even more concerning is that it doesn't matter what the scientists say. There's this huge disparity between the public perception on the safety of GM foods and GM crops versus what the public believes. And this preys on that appeal to nature fallacy. So genetically engineered crops are merely crops that we've accelerated the process of evolution and natural selection by controlling what genes we can change or alter or impart. And we can add beneficial characteristics. Like Kevin discussed yesterday, golden rice now produces vitamin A, which is a critical nutrient in countries that don't have access to foods that contain that. But if you go online, these are the messages. These are the images you're going to see. Oh, or we're injecting these toxins into fruits. That's not remotely what happens, but it gives people this perception that genetic engineering is unnatural and therefore it must be harmful. And of course, opponents to genetic engineering technology know the least, objectively. You see that as objective knowledge of GMOs decreases, so does opposition to it. So we sometimes call that the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the majority of people that think GMOs are harmful could not answer the question correctly about whether non-genetically modified tomatoes had genes. And spoiler, they do. Every organism has genes, even viruses, which we can have a debate on whether they count. And there are no commercially available GMO tomatoes in the US. And of course, when they're exposed to the correction, they have a very emotional reaction because this idea of this environmentalism and the harms of GMO is part of their identity, part of their culture, part of the cohort that they spend time with. But the concern is that this is going to spill over into other fields that also impact health. We know that genetic engineered crops are essential to improve food stability, food security, add nutrition to crops, address climate change. For example, HB4 wheat in Argentina can resist drought conditions, and that's going to save the economy and the food supply for Argentina. But I'm going to talk about CAR T therapy because that's my wheelhouse. So cancer cell therapy uses genetic engineering. We take immune cells from a patient with cancer, we genetically engineer those immune cells to better recognize cancer, because cancer cells have a lot of really cool tools to avoid recognition and clearance, which makes cancer very tricky to treat. And then we put those immune cells back in the patient. So a very simplified workflow. We harvest the blood from a patient with cancer. We isolate the immune cells, typically the T cells in this context. We're going to genetically engineer them. We're going to add a gene that's going to better allow them to recognize the given cancer. We're going to grow those up in Petri dishes. We're going to infuse those back in. Those immune cells are going to seek and destroy cancer. And we have dozens of FDA-approved cell therapies using this approach today, and they're saving lives. GMO crops use the same approach. We take plant cells and we genetically engineer them to have a beneficial characteristic, whether it is natural resistance to a virus, natural resistance to insect pests, so we don't need to spray them with pesticides. And that's exactly why GE crops have lower pesticide inputs. We've actually reduced the use of pesticides through the use of GM crops. So we use a bacteria called Agrobacterium tumefaciens, which normally infects plant cells anyway. So we're hijacking this natural process, and we give them the gene, and then we expose those plant cells to that bacteria, and they take up that gene and they integrate it. We grow them up into these little calli in a Petri dish and little plantlets. They're very cute. And then you eventually have a full-grown plant that now has this beneficial characteristic, and you can propagate that for future generations. So we have this cohort of people who are very accepting of these cancer cell therapies, but not the same tools that we're using in agriculture. In agriculture, it's harmful, it's unnatural, it's not safe. Now, chemophobia and toxic ingredients is another field in which the wellness industry, predominantly women, affluent women, moderately educated, fall prey to. And this is because they exploit health anxiety. They use scary sounding claims about the harms of toxic substances without context, or things are going to cause cancer without context. And that causes people to stop thinking critically and override any sort of fact-checking or logical thought process before sharing that information. So you're going to see headlines all the time. Substance X is going to give you cancer. Substance Z is toxic and will kill you. And then on the flip side, you've got all these other supplements and things that are going to make you live forever. So it really preys on this fear and this desire to take control of your health, because it really is hard to reconcile with the fact that sometimes you just don't have control over your health. You can do everything right and you would still develop cancer. You would still develop an autoimmune disorder. So parabens is a great example because it really exploited and grew during the clean beauty movement, which is really using this idea that natural chemicals are better than synthetic chemicals. And if you go online today and you type in parabens and harm or parabens and risk, you're going to get headline after headline after headline. Get rid of your skincare nasties. Get rid of your parabens. They're poison. Get rid of all these things that cause these adverse health effects. And you're going to find even medical providers like dermatologists who are saying these things. And it underscores the fact that different types of people have different expertise. If we're talking about the safety of a skincare product, a dermatologist is not the expert. A toxicologist is the expert. A cosmetic chemist is the expert. A cancer researcher is the expert. But parabens are an important class of chemicals. They are preservatives. They prevent microbial contamination in substances, cosmetics, skincare products, and so on. They inhibit the growth of bacteria and fungi that would contaminate and taint the product, and they extend the lifespan. They've been used for 100 years. They're very affordable, they're very safe, and they're very effective. They're derived from a chemical called 4-hydroxybenzoic acid. We basically remove an oxygen there. We replace it with an alcohol attached to a functional group, and now you have all these different paraben chemicals. But misinformation grew from this really poorly done study, and Nick talked a lot about the bad science that's out there yesterday. But this study in the Journal of Applied Toxicology in 2004, written by people that really didn't know what they were doing, insinuated that the fact that trace levels of parabens were found in 20 individual tumor biopsies that were cryopreserved insinuated that those were related to breast cancer. First, they had no healthy tissue controls. So we don't know what the levels of these detectable parabens were in healthy breast tissue. We don't know how those levels were related to cancer at all. They're just digging for a problem. And aside from that, if you actually looked at their blank values, I wrote a whole newsletter if you really want the granularity, but the blank values frequently had levels higher than what they're reporting in the breast tissue, which basically tells you that their instrumentation was contaminated. But just assume that these levels are accurate. We're talking about 2 parts per billion, which is tiny. For context, that would be 1 second of time in 31.7 years. So these are minuscule levels. But people ran with this because they used the phrase hormone disrupting and breast cancer. But if you actually look at what's real in the context of parabens, parabens have weak estrogenic activity, which means that maybe, theoretically, they could bind to estrogen receptor and they could lead to some of the cellular changes that estrogens do. But if you actually look what's real about this, estradiol, which is our bioactive version of estrogen, binds to estrogen receptor 100,000 times tighter than ethylparaben and methylparaben, and 10,000 times higher than butylparaben and propylparaben. So this is not estrogenic activity that you actually are ever going to experience health effects from. And there are decades of data that demonstrate this as well. But the cat was out of the bag and fear was spreading. And because of that, companies were forced to reformulate with alternative preservatives that were inferior. Phenoxyethanol, is less effective. It's not effective against fungi. It is less stable in different concentrations of water, so it needed to be augmented. You need a higher concentration for similar efficacy, and it's more expensive. So now, higher cost to your customers, higher costs to everyone. Another one, methyl isothiazolinone, or MIT, is less expensive, but it's not effective against fungi. It had to be augmented, but the worst thing is that this is less safe. There are about 10% of the population that have allergies to MIT compared to 1% in parabens. So when companies swapped out for MIT, dermatologic allergies skyrocketed. And then you had the extreme where companies just took out preservatives. And you can imagine what happened: contamination, infections, skin infections, eye infections, systemic infections. And this is beyond the beauty space, and that's why I like to talk about it, because it underscores the harm is more than just this one industry. Parabens are used in medical products too. Parabens are used in topical ointments like corticosteroids and antifungals. They're used in injectable medications like injectable anesthetics, and they're used in ophthalmic products. And we saw high levels of infections as a result of these contaminated products. And this chemophobia is now used to exploit the Gen Z, the social activists, the people that are pushing for women's representation in medicine, because we know that there's been systemic misogyny, systemic sexism, systemic underrepresentation. And so I'm sure all of you saw some of these headlines about the toxic tampon study this summer. Toxic tampons. Berkeley Public Health, they put out this press release that was wildly misleading. They said it was the first study to look at these trace impurities in tampon material because their researchers don't actually understand how regulatory oversight occurs for a Class 2 medical device. But of course, all of the headlines said the same thing: toxic, 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 heavy metals, your tampons are killing you. And all the wellness influencers came out with the same. And when you look at the actual study, it wasn't answering this question. They took 24 individual tampons off the shelf, they digested them in high acid and high temperature, ran them through very sensitive analytical chemistry equipment, and if it wasn't clear, that's not what a vagina is. A vagina has a pH of 4.5 and a temperature of 99 degrees. So is the study actually answering whether this is a source of exposure? No. And the reality is, all of the trace levels they found were far below the regulatory limits for all of these substances. And they're found in tampons because cotton is a plant, and these things exist in the environment. So plants pick up these trace impurities because they grow in the environment. But what it did was it created outrage among these social activists, the feminist movement. And I spoke with this reporter who actually did a great job. So I do want to give one shout out to the media, but she did a very balanced take on this is not something to fear. It underscores that we need more women's research, but this is not the way to do it. Then you have your medical conspiracists, and this is your far-right MAGA, MAHA movement. And this is really interesting because the wellness industry is wholly unregulated, and you find as people believe in more medical conspiracies, their alignment with wellness behaviors like buying organic food, which is not pesticide-free, taking supplements, which are unregulated, it also increases, and it's matched by a decline in evidence-based behaviors like going to the dentist, wearing sunscreen, getting your vaccines, getting well visits. When you look at those conspiracies, they're all about how the government is lying to you, the government is controlling you, the government is hiding the cure for cancer, the government is poisoning you with fluoride in your water, the government is using Monsanto and GE crops to depopulate the global planet. And this is the harm of the current era of the wellness industry, is that it's been co-opted by the far right, the libertarians, those who want to leverage deregulation that occurred in dietary supplements and expand it to food safety, medicine oversight, and so on. And so I wrote this piece with Katie Shuletta, is also here in the audience, but we wrote this for the audience of healthcare providers to underscore that this wellness industry really is causing harm. And I use cancer as an example because individuals who forego conventional cancer treatments they have worse health outcomes. They die faster. They have lower 5-year survival rates. Breast cancer patients who forego cancer treatments have a 5.7 times increased risk of death compared to those who do use conventional treatments. And that's not something that we can make light of. And we see this further. I don't know if anybody watched the recent Congressional Roundtable on Health and Nutrition that was hosted by Ron Johnson, the guy who literally doesn't want to improve health because he's blocked expansion of Medicaid, he's blocked affordable health care, he's pushed to deregulate supplements further. But Marty Makary, who was very prominent during the COVID pandemic, he claimed that pancreatic cancer rates have doubled in the last 20 years. So I pulled the numbers. And in 1992, the rate of pancreatic cancer was 11.1 per 100,000. In 2021, 30 years later, the rate was 13.2 cases per 100,000. So we're not doubling pancreatic cancer rates. This is a nice example of Neil's comment last night about how people don't understand statistics, even if you have an MD. But I did write about how the fact that all of these people that claim to care about health and safety and healthy food on this panel actually have long histories of doing the exact opposite. And that is true because now we've seen a resurgence of Vani Hari, the food babe. So she was on the panel. She petitioned Kellogg's shortly after that about how we needed to get rid of all the bad food dyes in the American version of Fruit Loops. But her solution isn't we should encourage people to eat more produce. We should tell people that conventional produce is safe. We should improve access to healthcare. It was, well, no, we should just swap those food dyes for the Australian food dyes because those ones are safer. But if you look at the Australian food dyes, well, they're actually banned in the US because our regulatory agencies have decided that there's not enough data to demonstrate they're safe. So are they actually better? No, but she doesn't understand anything about basic chemistry or regulatory oversight, and she has fallen prey to all of those sorts of misinformation. She's also targeting a single entity company while saying that her goal is to make people healthy, but she's now aligned with the RFK Jr. movement where they want to continue to gut the FDA and the USDA, who are the people that actually oversee the safety of our food supply. And we've got celebrities on board. We've got media outlets on board. I found this last night about myself. Didn't even realize it exists. But I commented because Eva Mendes posted Vani Hari's post, and she has 6.4 million followers. And I felt obligated to comment that she was sharing misinformation. Those food dyes aren't banned. There's no evidence that they're unsafe. This is the data for all of the countries. They're not banned. They have similar acceptable daily intake levels. Will Cole, who I'm apparently compared and contrasted with, he is a chiropractor that is on Goop's medical team. And then I wrote a follow-up piece about if you really cared about the health of our food, well, the Trump-era regulations actually gutted the FDA and the USDA, so now there's fewer food inspections. They've increased the speed at which animals can be processed in facilities, so they're actually doing more harm about food safety. It's not about changing a single food dye. It's about looking at the social determinants of health. Now, I'm going to call out the progressive liberals, too. Educated and progressive liberals say they say that science is real. But do they act that way? And I'm going to pick on Gavin Newsom, because he's been doing a lot. Gavin Newsom, give him credit, very staunch advocate for vaccines. California removed the personal exemptions in 2015 after a measles outbreak that started in Disneyland. But at the same time, he is banning the same food dyes that Vani Hari is targeting. And he's doing it even though the FDA says that these levels of food dyes are safe and they're regulated. And why is he doing it? Because his ideology and his constituents have fallen prey to the anti-science activist groups like the Environmental Working Group and Consumer Reports. Spoiler, they co-sponsored those bills. And the media outlets are using them as experts and saying that these are carcinogenic chemicals, that these are unsafe, they're causing behavioral issues, when again, there's tons of data to demonstrate that they're legal, they're regulated, they're safe, and they're used in other countries. They're not banned in other countries. But what happens when you have media sensationalism is that that spreads misinformation, which causes consumer fears, public outcry, and that pressures the market. Whatever market we're talking about, that market demand changes the formulation because of public outcry, not because of safety. That legitimizes the misinformation. By legitimizing that, that leads to these anti-science policies and laws, which leads to interference with our regulatory agencies that are designed to keep us safe, and it impacts other industries. You think you're just affecting a food, but you're affecting an important solvent that is critical for manufacturing medications. And as a result, we have worse health and economic outcomes. So what can we do? Well, scientists like me, we've stepped into the foray. We need to communicate in a way that resonates with people. We need to not simply correct things, but also give them the history, give them the context. Use plain language summaries. Journalists, Rena talked about this at length, so I'm not going to rehash that, but they need to use credible experts. They need to be better about putting into context things that are real, and they need to avoid clickbait. And again, if we're talking about credible experts, that does not mean using a healthcare provider when you're talking about a complex scientific topic, because those people, while they work in a similar sphere, they have very different skill sets. And companies and organizations, we're hearing all the time that there's a crisis of misinformation. Well, where's the infrastructure? The wellness industry is worth $5.6 trillion, and all of us are playing this game of whack-a-mole in our free time, volunteering to create content. And I want to leave the scientists in the room with this quote by Richard Feynman, and this goes back to 1964 in one of his very famous lectures, but he was talking about the challenges of pseudoscience. He said, I believe that science has remained irrelevant because we wait until somebody asks us a question or until we're asked or invited to give a speech on Einstein's theory to people who don't understand Newtonian mechanics, but we are never invited to give an attack on faith healing or astrology. I suggest, maybe incorrectly and perhaps wrongly, that we are too polite. And I don't agree that he is incorrect. I think he is very correct. I think we are at a point where we no longer can afford to be polite about things that are tangibly impacting our health and the health of our planet. And I'm going to call one thing out for the non-scientists, non-journalists in the audience. People now trust people like them more than experts. So you have an important job to play. You are the people that can garner trust. So what can you do with that trust? You can create a network of sources and credible experts that put out real, accurate content. Verify and cross-reference those. Amplify the credible information with your friends and family, your loved ones, anyone that needs to see it. Help drown the misinformation that spreads more quickly. And use media literacy skills. So always ask these 3 questions. Who's the source of the information? Is it first party? Is it second party? Is it third party? Why are they sharing it? What's their motive? Is it a financial motive? Is it an educational motive? And can you verify it with multiple additional credible sources? We need to remember that misinformation spreads like a viral pathogen. And if we can block one of the nodes of the spread of that misinformation, we can start to reduce how much falsehoods impact all of us in our daily lives. Thank you.